Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Mrs. Happy Catholic, and I'm on today with my new friend Kevin, who generously offered to come on and share his story, a little bit about his faith journey, and to have a conversation, including his love of Shakespeare, because he is a teacher at a classical academy. And so we're really excited to have you on, Kevin, and to learn from you. Thanks for coming.
Awesome. I'm very excited to be here.
Awesome, cool. Well, I don't know if you want to share just a little bit about your growing up, like were you raised Catholic? What was normal for you, kind of, to get things started?
Yeah, I believe that I was baptized by Lutheran Protestant Christians, and I was initially raised Lutheran, like in the very early years of my life, such that I can't even really remember it. I just think that I was. And then at some point, still pretty early on, we were brought into full communion with the Roman Catholic Church, and we started to be raised Roman Catholic Christian. And I don't know, I would say that my religious upbringing was pretty general for whatever that would have been in the 1990s in the Catholic Church in America, which somewhat watered down, okay. But like we got the basic dogmas and doctrines. And I was a believer, and I really can't remember a time when I didn't believe in Jesus and his divinity and the Trinity and everything. But at the same time, I was somewhat worldly early on too, and we were taken to a Catholic school, for grade school and going into high school, and I just remember being pretty worldly, but also having like a kind of core of belief. And then things started to get particularly interesting when I was maybe in 7th or 8th grade or so, and my mother started seeing some things in the liturgy at our local Catholic church in northern Ohio. I'll just say that raised some eyebrows. Things like liturgical dance and maybe this or that other thing. Again, I can't really remember, but I think liturgical dance was one of them. And at that point, my mother decided that she wanted to find somewhere else for my family to go for Sunday Mass. So we went church shopping, as far as I could tell. And pretty quickly, we ended up at the local SSPX chapel in northern Ohio. And that's where I'll stop there if you want to explore that, but that's like the first to be continued. We ended up at the local SSPX chapel.
Okay, well, that's kind of an interesting time in your life to have to make that shift too. And I wonder how that felt for you. Different. I don't know how involved you were in the
Mm-hmm.
parish, but I mean, and changing everybody that you went to church with, and like probably a lot of
Right.
externals were different, and even the atmosphere. Like, I'm curious how that
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was very different, certainly. I mean, first I was like, wow, this is very mystifying and different, and I didn't know what to make of it. And I certainly didn't know Latin. But still, I was just kind of the mindset of, well, I believe in the basics, but as far as all this other stuff goes, this is just a new place that we're going to go to on Sunday, which afterwards I'm going to get back to reading my comic books and get back to the things that give me frivolous enjoyment. So it was just kind of like a new, somewhat strange place that we'd be going, but I was just kind of going with the flow of it and didn't question it too much. What did end up happening, I would say, is that not too long after we were there, uh, the priest there kind of recruited me to become an altar server there, and there were other young guys like me who were already over there serving at the altar. And it was a pretty small chapel. I don't know, if I had to guess in retrospect, maybe oh, I don't know, 1 to 200 people or so. Comparatively small. And I got I was asked to start serving at mass there, and how can I say no? It's like, oh, the priest wants you to see if you can start serving mass there. So how could I resist? And I took it up, and I'd say that's like my faith really started to grow there. Okay, um, if nothing else, I saw these people take this stuff seriously here. They're taking things seriously, which wasn't and isn't always the case at one's local like normal Catholic church. Okay, so that's something that it made an impression on me was that they're taking things seriously here, and there's kind of like an intellectual and spiritual challenge here, and I felt challenged, and I got interested. In it.
Wow. Okay, so then how long were you guys at this chapel before kind of the next thing developed?
Years, at least. I mean, all in all, I was going to SSPX chapels for about 10 years. I got into things there. I kind of generally adopted their view of things, rejection of Vatican II, major problems with the Novus Ordo Mass, getting interested in learning about the faith, at least, as far as what the SSPX was willing to give me. And I just kind of like went along with it for many years. We weren't super socially into the chapel. We weren't, like super socially into the things that they had going on there after Mass. I mean, for us, it was basically just coffee and donuts for about a half hour and just kind of chit chat with whoever. And again, for myself, at least, that was, in talking to the other youngish guys there. And so we didn't get socially into it the way that I know that other people do and can, really get kind of like burned socially, like at some point or another. That really wasn't my family's situation there. We went there for Mass, socialized a little bit afterwards, and then I kind of just went back and we led our lives back at home. It was about a 40-minute drive, 35-minute drive to this place from our house. So we were at a little bit of a distance from it, but I got interested in the faith more than I had been before. By that point then, I was in high school. I was probably being a little bit of a pest in terms of, I don't know, like my traditionalism at the local Catholic school, and was somewhat aggressive about it at times, certainly. But the whole point, though, is like, I was taking things seriously. I was going in the other direction. Okay, I was taking things super seriously, and but still had kind of like my secular life on the side. I was, I was still pretty secular, and I would say that things just kind of went along that way for years. And then some developments started happening. There started to be some drama that was starting to get churned up at the chapel. I don't remember the details, but I just know that our pastor there was starting to experience some tension with some of the parishioners there about things like fundraising, and also him trying to very aggressively get as many families on board with going to their little SSPX school there. He was very very adamant to try to get as many families at the chapel to go to the little SSPX school there as he could. And I remember it was starting to cause some tension. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I was reading more and more about the Catholic faith. I was picking up books like My Catholic Faith, that classic, I think like 1950s or so catechism book, My Catholic Faith. Have you heard of it? Mm-hmm. You know of it? Yeah, I like it a lot. It's got the cool pictures, and it's got like various cultural things in it, and it's just very well rounded, at least for for back then and stuff. And, even today, it's still like a really good text. Okay. But at the same time, something that was also happening kind of as I was getting into college, okay, is in our little chapel house that we had associated with the chapel, the SSPX little chapel house, they had their own bookshelf of like books that you could take out, as if like library kind of borrowing sort of thing. And I noticed a book called The Ratzinger Report in there. Yeah. And I was like, oh, I kind of recognize this guy. I think I maybe came across it maybe right around the time that Benedict became Pope. And I don't know, like it drew me to it. I wanted to read it. And I did. And it started to raise some eyebrows because I'm sure that I was coming across things in the My Catholic Faith book when it came to matters of authority and church hierarchy and indefectibility and stuff that I was definitely starting to not be able to square up with the SSPX situation. Yeah. And at the same time, I started reading the Ratzinger book too. And I'm like, oh, well, this guy is, he's lauding Vatican II, he's upholding it, and he's saying, like, we can't go back. Okay, it's an ecumenical council, and it has a certain amount of authority behind it. And yet, at the same time, he was willing to, like, pick a little bit here and there at the implementation of the liturgy. Okay, and he was somebody who's perfectly fine with okay, let's talk about this a little bit, like imperfections in terms of the rollout of the liturgy. So he was aware of that. And so I found in Ratzinger an intellectual level of taking this on that I felt was like a little bit less stilted, a little bit less cramped than what I was getting at the SSPX at the time. At the same time, though, I'll just close out this part with this. I ended up moving down to Ohio State University. My whole kind of college journey, I was jumping from one school to another for many years. But I moved down to Ohio State University, and I started to make friends down there with normal Catholics, okay, who, I'll just say like non-SSPXers, okay, and I started to make friends with them, and they were a lot smarter about church doctrine and church history than I was at that point, and I was continually having to kind of yield to their knowledge and like learn things from them that I didn't know, especially about church history and maybe like finer points of doctrinal things. And they were more devout than I was, but they weren't traditionalists. They would go to the Fraternity of St. Peter, okay, like for a Latin mass pretty frequently, but they certainly weren't going to the SSPX, okay, and they were going to the Novus Ordo mass very frequently, and so that started to have an effect on me, okay, like, how do I make sense of this? All right, how do I make sense of this?
Oh, that's so interesting.
So the plot was thickening at that point.
I'm amazed that book was even in the church library, the Ratzinger Report. I mean, really, how did that happen? Because
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if they read it. I don't know, but I read it.
That's awesome.
I also, one of the other things that I came across in the SSPX little kind of chapel house, and I have to hand it to them that it really kind of gave me a vocation. I came across these audio tape lectures by a guy by the name of Dr. David Allen White, who, God rest his soul, recently passed away over the past year or so. And he's a layman, but he was a professor of literature who would go to the SSPX seminary on a, I don't know, annual or semi-annual basis. And Bishop Williamson would invite him over there to give talks to the rising seminarians about literature. And I started listening to these pretty early on when I started going to these SSPX chapels. And I was just enthralled. I was mesmerized. Dr. White would talk about literature from, like a general kind of Catholic standpoint, especially Shakespeare. And I was like, I want to do that. Like I want to have that kind of knowledge. I want to be as, I don't know, like kind of just like entertaining of a speaker as he was, and be able to open up these works of literature the way that he did. So he very much inspired me. I was listening to his tapes nonstop, in and out. Any new ones that came out, I got my hands on them very quickly. And eventually he and I became friends. I got to meet him in person and, would call him occasionally, and even went on a cruise that he was on, and, spent some time around him. So I got to kind of be around my hero for a while, but that was a significant factor that I got through the SSPX.
Wow, amazing. I mean, just how God plants these things. He wants us to find no matter where you are. Like, he comes
Yes.
to you. That is so cool. And so cool that you got to meet him and that you've had this relationship over these years that helped form you. And yeah, now you can take that and share it with your own students.
Yeah, keep him in your prayers. He had a wonderful personality, and he was really good at talking about things through these works of literature. Um, but yeah, one of the other developments that happened though is when I went down to Columbus, even though I was Columbus, Ohio, for Ohio State University, finishing up my bachelor's degree in English, there wasn't an SSPX chapel down there. There was a Sedevacantist chapel down there, and some of the people that were at it, some of the clergy that were at it, Father Cicada, Father Anthony Cicada, as well as Father. I don't. He was Bishop Dolan, and these two were part of the so-called the Nine that had left the SSPX, who came to butt heads with Lefebvre at one point, and over matters of, I think, like which liturgy were they going to be offering, and they were questioning him about like which pre-Vatican II liturgy were they all going to be doing. And I can't remember the rest, but it ended up into a big like kind of lawyerly property dispute about properties, and it got pretty ugly. But in any case, they had a chapel down in Columbus, and I started poking my head around there, because even though I wasn't Sedevacantist, nonetheless I was just kind of like looking for a Latin mass to go to, and I hadn't yet come to the possibility of going to a Fraternity of St. Peter parish or any other chapel that was in full communion with Rome. I wasn't quite ready for that yet. And so I started going to a Sedevacantist chapel for a lot of masses down there. And certainly that was interesting. I mean, if you find some interesting personalities at traditionalist chapels, sometimes, the temperature only gets heated up further at the Sedevacantist chapels, naturally, because you're becoming more and more radical in those situations. Okay. It's not surprising. It makes sense. But I was starting to go there, even though I wasn't a Sedevacantist, and they were starting to think about having me teach at maybe at one of their schools once I graduated and stuff like that. And I was kind of like pushing that away. I kind of was keeping them at an arm's distance, but I found them interesting because certainly the Sedevacantists make some really good arguments against the SSPX. Okay. They call out the SSPX for their recognize and resist position, which is incoherent. So I found some of the things that they had to say about the SSPX interesting, and I just found some of their discussions, some of what they had to say about like the disputes that they got into with Lefebvre really interesting and kind of sassy, kind of entertaining just to read as well. And so I don't know, like my whole kind of view of the traditionalist landscape was further expanding there.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say too, like in listening to I think that he's passed away now, Bishop Dolan. He had a very honeyed tongue. He was one of those guys who, like, could really speak in a very charitable kind of like winning manner that like was very attractive. And I found, like, a lot of his sermons very attractive, and he was one of the more gifted speakers in the traditionalist community. Maybe not so much Father Cicada. I don't know. Father Cicada's, like, very much more of like kind of a hardcore lawyerly type, very dry, and he was one of the foremost apologists as far as writing material that was put out by the Sedevacantist, Anthony Cicada. But yeah, I was checking out their chapel down there a little bit, but I stopped going because I came to the view that, like, that's the Sedevacantists definitely weren't for me. And I simply stopped going to mass for a little while. And because, again, I wasn't ready yet for, anything that was in full communion with Rome had to offer. And to his credit, one of my good friends that I'd made, who was going to, normal Catholic chapels, he said to me that he was concerned for my soul, and I appreciated that. And after he said that, I think I started to ride with somebody who was a regular SSPX goer, but he lived in Columbus, but he started going to Cincinnati because the SSPX had a chapel in Cincinnati. So I forget how long of a car ride that was, but
Oh,
I started going there sometimes. I didn't go there a bunch of times, but I started going there sometimes. And they had a big old chapel over there, lots of people, lots of families, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know, at that point, I was starting to open up a little bit to, again, I don't know if it was like the Fraternity of St. Peter or some other group that was in Columbus that was in full communion with Rome, but there was some kind of Latin Mass being offered in Columbus in full communion with Rome that my friends started to get me into, like that. And I remember I was quite scared, I think, like when I first went into it, that there was this sense of like wading into a pool that, like, I didn't know how warm or how cold it was going to be, so I was very careful. But they got me to go to it, and that was kind of the next big shift there.
wow. I mean, it's so interesting how you did. It's like you start out in the mainstream church, you go to the SSPX, and then you're going set of a contest, but not really. But then you're kind of like a home aloner, which is really how it goes. It's like the
Yeah,
natural progression of following the ideas to their conclusion and being kind of in this lost place where you're just isolated because it's like there is nowhere to go.
yeah,
And the big church is scary. It's like, I can't go there. That's the one place I
yeah,
really
yeah,
can't go.
yeah. When I mean, when I was getting ready to go down to Columbus to, like, be going to school down there, I remember asking, like, my SSPX priest up in northern Ohio, like, like, what does he think of, like, if I can find a Latin Mass down there? And I don't think that he was especially encouraging of anything if it wasn't the SSPX. I could be wrong. It was such a long time ago. Maybe he was, but I think my instinct was, at the very least, he was of the mind of, like, well, yeah, you can go to some, like, Fraternity of St. Peter Latin Mass or something, but, like, there's this sense of, like, caution, or there's this sense of, like, I don't know. And that, was, the SSPX gives that impression at the very least, if not, more. Like, obviously their party line more so is stay away from the fraternity, okay? But I don't know. I was always among them, but I was never one of them, really. And that's just going to become more and more clear. I always kept them at an arm's distance, regardless of whatever extent I adapted any of their positions at one point or another. I always had my own life kind of going on the side, and no doubt they would be like, yes, and see, and that's why he's no longer with us. It's like, well, sorry everybody. Yeah, I just I knew more people than I knew when I was with them. I had more things opening up to me. I was reading more than what they were offering me. Although, thanks for the Ratzinger reports, but yeah, they were not the be all end all of my life at that point. So there were more pipelines for God's grace to come into my life. But yeah, I'll just close that part out by saying that yeah, there was a period of time when I was down in Columbus when I didn't know what I was doing or what I was going to do. I knew I wasn't sedevacantist, but I don't know, I kind of got slowly pulled into a diocesan Latin Mass, thanks to my friends who knew more about these things than I did, knew more about church history than I did, and were at least a little bit more devout than I was. I mean, we had plenty of fun down there, but you know, they were good. They went to daily mass more than I did, certainly. So you know, I had to square that with my situation.
Wow, interesting. I mean, it's so cool that you could find people like that you clicked with and could have in your life, because you haven't mentioned having any close friends from the SSPX time.
No, not really. No, I had a couple friends that were fellow altar servers who we would hang out not often at all. Okay, it was mostly through church activities that we would hang out, but outside of that, not so much. I already kind of just had my own crew, had my own group, you know, in various other spheres of my life, and I don't know. Quite frankly, as far as I could tell, now that I reflect on it, the altar servers that I was friends with in the SSPX, I don't think that they necessarily like were super close and into the social milieu of the SSPX either. I think that they kind of had their own friends as well, and they were kind of close knit, but they weren't part of whatever larger, you know, kind of social culture they were trying to build at the chapel there.
Interesting. Oh,
Yeah.
this is interesting too, to just kind of contrast, because like usually the women that I talk to who have been in traditionalist communities were a lot more integrated into the social life and the peer pressure
The
and like,
yeah.
yeah, like the culture and the expectations and things, even if they weren't like doing stuff with people all the time, but they're very aware, and like people would like tell them what they needed to be doing and all, so it's like, but
Oh yeah.
men tend to be more kind of like, I'm my own agent, I come and I go. And like when they leave, it seems like a cleaner break. Like, yes, you're
Yeah.
still spending years sorting through all the mentalities and the effect, but it's not as obvious immediately on the surface, but also maybe there's not so much entanglement with I don't know, like whatever goes
The
on the inner
the
workings.
chapel that I was attending for the SSPX in Northern Ohio, it was pretty small. It was probably, it may have been like kind of less social even amongst itself than other SSPX chapels would be. In comparison, the one that I saw in Cincinnati was bigger, kind of more socially, I don't know, like kind of lively. And so, you know, even amongst the SSPX, I would imagine that you're going to get some differences depending on the size of the chapel and just the ages and the personalities involved, I suspect.
Right. No, that's
Yeah.
true. Definitely. I've heard there's a big contrast between the smaller communities and the large ones, and a lot more drama and things
Yeah.
that go on there. So yeah, no, okay. Okay, so you're going to this diocesan Latin Mass. Was your family of origin, had they kind of moved on, or were they like, he's crazy, he's going over
No, my father was not attending church at all, really. My mother was still attending the SSPX up in Northern Ohio. And my sister was living elsewhere in the country pursuing her career at the time, and she was you know, going to whichever Catholic chapel was in the area. So she wasn't, you know, like tied to the SSPX either, okay, at this point. But when we would go home, like, you know, to visit home, okay, I was still we would still go to the SSPX chapel with my mother. Uh after I got my bachelor's degree, I ended up I started going to Kent State University for a master's degree. And that was much closer to that SSPX chapel in Northern Ohio. And I would catch rides from different parishioners to go there. And I was still going there. And as I was getting my master's degree, they brought me in. I was happy to join to help teach at their local SSPX school in, I believe it's still in Richfield, Ohio. And as I was teaching there, I was helping out just like with some of their drama and the drama class and the English literature and some other things as well. Just some basic stuff. But at the same time, I was getting my master's degree at Kent State. And I think that that's kind of where some further intellectual development started happening. I started studying Shakespeare more intensely and started to get a bit more into the whole Shakespeare as a crypto-Catholic strain of scholarship that started to become quite popular in the late 90s, early 2000s, and as far as I can tell, to this day has still become like a pretty accepted way of viewing Shakespeare, as opposed to viewing him as an Anglican Protestant, which was kind of the accepted view for a long time. Nowadays, it's a lot more accepting, and even maybe it was kind of trendy for a while. It might still be to kind of, take on Shakespeare as a, if not as a flat out Roman Catholic, it maybe at least as somebody who's got some sympathies in that direction. And I started focusing in on one play in particular, Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. And have you read much Shakespeare, or are you into Shakespeare at all?
No, I do. I love Shakespeare. I'm not an expert, but no, I've really enjoyed him. And I also years ago went through Joseph Pierce's Shakespeare's Catholicism course because I was like, oh, that's
okay,
interesting. And
yeah, there you go.
I was going to ask you what you thought about that. So,
yeah, I've met Joseph Pierce on 2 different occasions. Once when the Lord of the Rings movies were first coming out. And so the books kind of came into my view then, and I started reading the books for the first time. And then I went to a talk that he gave at this big manor house about the Lord of the Rings and Catholicism. And we had a good talk there afterwards. And I forgot, I think I went to a Shakespearean Catholicism conference at some point, and Hugh might have been at that as well. So yeah, he and I have spoken a couple times, and he's great. He's great fun. I ended up doing some writing on Twelfth Night, where there's the antagonist in that play is Malvolio. Mm-hmm. And although he's not literally a Puritan, he's called a kind of Puritan at one point by some of the characters because they're all trying to have a lot of fun. They're partying into the wee hours of the night. And Malvolio, he's trying to kind of like keep the house in order. He's the steward of the house, and the house is in mourning. It is in a state of mourning, and he's trying to kind of keep things under control. And he gets into conflict with the other characters there, and they kind of view him as a sort of a killjoy. Mm-hmm. And the thing that ends up happening in that play that becomes pretty interesting is I'm not going to say he's in love with Olivia, who's the head of the household, but he does have designs. He'd love to marry her for at least to become the head of the household, to come into like her property and to rule the household and to boss everybody around. I wouldn't say that he's in love with her, but he wants the social and economic benefits that would come with marrying her. And the rest of the characters, or at least a handful of them, they're aware of this. And so what they do is a joke on him. Do you remember? Have you read the play? Do you remember what they do to...
It's been a long time. Oh, no, tell us.
Okay. One of the characters, Maria, either Marie or Maria, she writes a letter. She's able to mimic the handwriting of Olivia, and she writes a mock fake love letter to, well, she doesn't say that it's to Malvolio, but she puts in different clues in the letter that kind of connect to him in different ways. And she basically lays it out as like, I'm in love with this person. There's like different clues in the letter. And, if you want to return my love, you will do these absurd things like wear yellow stockings and
That's right.
smile and do all this absurd stuff in order to signal that you are accepting my invitation to you here. Okay.
Oh, I forgot about this part in the play. That's right. It's
Yeah.
so funny. Okay, because he does all the things, doesn't
Right.
he?
Right.
Okay.
And the letter too, it has a kind of a feel of like whoever's writing the letter has like chosen him. You might say like that he's the elect. Okay. It's got this kind of spiritual, high-minded tone to it, which then when you combine with the fact that he's described as a kind of Puritan, it starts to take on a kind of a religious quality of a sort here. And what ends up happening is, like a lot of the criticism that looks at this play, they've looked at this and they argue that Malvolio misinterprets the letter in the sense that he like twists things out of context and bends things to his will. Okay. And what I ended up doing in my article on this that I ended up writing is, after taking a good long look at it and then trying to differentiate myself from others and also seeing what some other people had to say about this, I ended up arguing that it's not really so much that Malvolio misinterprets or twists the letter or takes things out of context. As one critic said, they said something to the effect of like Sherlock Holmes himself would have interpreted this letter as if it was meant for Malvolio. In other words, Malvolio is not engaging in any kind of like textual manipulation, really, or to whatever extent that he is, it's overblown, is what I've said that like previous criticism has done here. And instead, and this is the way that I made sense out of things, the reason that Malvolio is the reason that he cannot understand what he's dealing with here is the letter that was written here is generated out of a pretextual oral community of persons who share amongst themselves and pass on the proper context for understanding the letter. And if you're not part of that community, if you are not part of that community, then you cannot necessarily have any hope of properly understanding the letter. You might say, in a sense, that the letter needs oral tradition in order to be properly understood. Okay, it's not Malvolio's problem is not that he twists and and distorts the letter. He does the best he can for the most part, and comes to a relatively reasonable conclusion. He's got to play around with like one or two things here or there, but it's not as nearly as bad as previous criticism has made it out to be. He's actually does a pretty good job with it. His problem is that he has put himself at odds with the social community out of which the letter was born, and so he can't understand it. Okay. And I ended up arguing in my essay that this is akin to what the Protestant Church of England conformist writers who were trying to uphold episcopacy against the Puritans, okay? So we're talking about an intra-Protestant conflict here, okay? Church of England Protestants against more radical Protestants. What I ended up arguing was that this, what Shakespeare's doing in this play is he's showing how if you're going to understand the scriptures rightly, you need to have respect for and understand that the scriptures didn't just like drop down out of the sky, okay? But they are part of a living community ultimately. Now, Shakespeare is dealing with that on the level of Church of England versus Puritans, but the reality is that in as much as the Church of England was still upholding episcopacy against Puritanism, that's something that is certainly going in the direction of Catholic authority and hierarchy, okay? I mean, the Church of England wanted to keep episcopacy, but they wanted to trade in the monarch of England for the Pope and get rid of infallibility as well in a sort of way. But they wanted to keep hierarchy, okay? So in other words, what the play is doing, I ended up arguing, is putting the idea out there that that external authority, not internal authority, but external authority is something that's necessary to understand the scriptures. And in that play, Shakespeare, granted, he's working with an inter-Protestant conflict as he understood at the time, but it's heading in the direction of something much bigger that speaks to his Catholic upbringing, okay? Not the Protestantism of his time, but his Catholic upbringing.
Wow. That's really interesting. Okay. So, and I'm kind of seeing a parallel here too, which is maybe where you're going to go to, is with the traditionalist movement that's kind of like taken certain things out of context. They've separated them from the continuity of tradition, the living magisterium, all these things. It's like, we're going to take this piece and we're just going to put it over here and we're going to sit with it. And how weird it gets after a while because it's divorced from the whole, which makes it make sense.
Sure. Yes, okay. Precisely. And let me think of where I want to go here from this, because there's so much. But
that's a great diving board.
As I was putting that article together, I think that I was learning more and more about the faith, and I was starting to read a lot of Catholic apologetics against Protestantism and Protestant critiques of Catholicism. And so I was getting a really sharp idea in my head of what the church has to say about the matter of private interpretation, okay, and private judgment. And by the time that by the time 2008, 2009 rolled around, my father had passed away in 2007, and he passed away at a time that I was really starting to break with traditionalism in a couple different ways. I was reading things online. There's a website. It's called Rorate Caeli. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's a traditionalist website. And they don't do this anymore, but back in the day, in the mid 2000s and the late 2000s, for every article of theirs, they had comment boxes. They don't do this anymore, I don't think, but they used to have comment boxes. And one of the things that I would see on there that I was highly interested in, highly entertained by, there was somebody in those com boxes who went under the screen name Jordanes, Jordanes, and he would get into these debates again and again and again with some John McFarland fellow or something, I don't know. And this McFarland fellow was this very stern defender of the SSPX. And Jordanes was just this very mild-mannered, very charitable, but extremely sharp, uh, normal Catholic. Okay, and I would see them get into lots of arguments about John Paul II's encyclicals and various things regarding Vatican II. And it was the same thing again and again and again, in the sense that this traditionalist fellow would put some sort of like very sharp criticism of some kind forward with a very kind of cynical reading of whatever it was that they were talking about. And Jordanes would effortlessly, and supremely charitably just be like, nope, this is what's actually going on here, and you're misreading this, and here's what you need to like be thinking about instead. And then McFarlane would come back with like, no, like it's this, like, and then it would be the same. Like Jordanes would just come forward with like, nope, it's just this, and you're overlooking this, and here's this thing about in the tradition of the church that apparently you overlooked, or this thing about like Catholic like theology, or some aspect of philosophy. And I would just be very impressed by this. Okay,
How many
I'd
people went to that website just to see what they were chatting about lately between the two of them?
I don't know. I could care less what the articles were about. I was just there for the comment box discussions. So that started to have an influence on me. And at the same time, there was also a website that went under the title Lumen Gentleman. Lumen Gentleman. Obviously, like a play off of Lumen Gentium. And there was a guy on there by the name of Jacob Michael who ran the website. I don't know where he is or what he's doing nowadays. I've like scoured the internet for him because I was so impressed with his website back then. But he was kind of like a quasi-traditionalist who was working through some things, but he was taking a very sharp razor of critical thinking to everything, and he was thinking himself into, I think that he was thinking himself into acceptance of Vatican II, acceptance of the Novus Ordo Mass, and regardless of whatever kinds of criticisms one wants to make about any of these things, nonetheless accepting them, in as much as the church asks us to accept them and stuff, and and accept the Catholic, the fundamental Catholicity of the Novus Ordo Mass, and accept the fundamental lowercase o orthodoxy of Vatican II. Okay, and he was writing lots of articles on there that were really interesting, I thought, and he ended up producing a little book. It's hard to get a hold of. You can get a hold of it on Lulu Press. It's called From Icone to Rome, Leaving the SSPX Without Saying Schism. He details in this his time going to SSPX chapels, his drama with the SSPX, and his leaving them for a normal diocesan situation. And some of the things that he has to say in there are very interesting, as far as, the ironies that one runs into once one starts to, question the SSPX, etc. But he's also got some interesting work, some other essays in there. One of them is an essay in which I believe it was Tichier de Malers, the bishop, one of the two surviving bishops for now of the SSPX. De Malers did a whole critique of Ratzinger's Introduction to Theology book, and de Malers called it a book full of heresies. And at the time, Jacob Michael was called upon to write like a kind of a review or a reaction to this little controversy that was going on. And his article was an extended defense of Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity book. And he explains how de Malers completely misread it in various crucial parts. Okay. He's got some other interesting articles in there about Nostra Aetate and about Lumen Gentium, and the all the controversy surrounding the phrase subsists in. Okay. And so I don't know, I found this to be a very interesting book. It kind of informed me about a lot of things. And I bring him up because I started talking to him on, you'll remember this perhaps, AOL Instant Messenger.
Yeah. Oh man. Right.
With the little yellow emblem guy.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was so cool.
Yeah, those were the early days of like kind of like social media, I guess.
Yeah, right.
And I found him on there. We talked, and I remember it was again, this happened around the time that my dad died too, so I was just like going through like a lot of emotional turmoil as well. But he and I were talking on there, and I remember he told me, you've got to accept the Novus Ordo Mass. That's like, like a big, like kind of linchpin in coming to a better orientation towards all of the controversies. Is you've got to come to grips with the Novus Ordo Mass. And I remember when he was telling me that, and I was also the other thing that was happening when I was talking to him, I started thinking about going to confession to a normal Catholic priest. And I remember it was maybe like a Saturday afternoon or something, and he was encouraging me to go as we were talking on AOL Instant Messenger. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go. I'm going to take the plunge. Okay. And I went down the road to the local Catholic chapel. And I remember when I went there, after I made my confession, but before I was given absolution, I said to the priest, now, Father, can you please just give me like the normal traditional absolution formula? Because, there are priests out there, of course, who are going to, who screw around with it, unfortunately. We know that happens. But also, of course, I'd been warned, or maybe I wasn't warned, but I had the perception of perhaps being warned of like what's out there in the Novus Ordo by like my SSPX priest. Okay, I at least had that perception, even if he didn't warn me explicitly. So I was on pins and needles, and the priest, the way that he reacted was, of course, that's what I give all of my penitents, and I was very relieved. Okay. And so I was just very happy about that. And I remember walking out of there, and it was snowing, and it was very like kind of beautiful and sublime looking as I walked home from that. And I was like, I had this feeling in me of like, I made the right decision.
Wow.
And I did, and I started making further steps. I started going to, the occasional Novus Ordo Mass, and I was reading more and more. And at that point, I was still doing some teaching at the SSPX school, but I was starting to realize I'm going to be on my way out of here. I am not going to be sticking around this. I am on my way out. I'm not like completely out yet. It was like a little process of some kind, but I was starting to open the door and walk out. And I remember it was very amusing. One day, maybe before or after Mass at the SSPX, I somehow got into conversation with one of the other parishioners there, and somehow it came up like that I'd gone to the Novus Ordo Mass somewhere, and they're like, well, like, don't you have a problem with it? And I was like, yeah, but like, I don't have the kind of problem with it that you guys have with it anymore. It was just a sense of like, like I've got like maybe a little bit of a critique towards it, but I don't have the problems that you guys have with it anymore. And I don't think it took long for that to get around, because it wasn't too long afterwards. One of the other teachers at the school during the school day, like, asked to talk to me privately in another room. And they're like, yes, like I've heard that, like, you're okay with the Novus Ordo Mass now. And I was like, yep. Yep, I am. And he was just aghast, and I was like, "Well, don't worry about it. Like, I'm not gonna like go shouting this to the children here that we're teaching it." But still, it was this sense of like, well, like this isn't okay. Okay, like we're gonna have to figure this out or something. I was like, whatever. And so, I, as anybody who leaves a group that is claiming to have some amount of like authority or something, but you're like halfway out the door. I was in that stage. I'm not going to say it was right that I took this attitude, but I had this mischievous, sort of rebellious sensibility in me at that point of, I'm not on my way. I'm not out yet. I'm on my way out. But until I'm fully out, I'm going to have some fun with this. I'm going to have some fun being the fly in the ointment here. I'm going to be the person who says some of the things that are like unmentionable around here, and just to see people's reaction. Maybe some people will follow me or something. So I had that kind of attitude about it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I bet that went over well.
I was spending less and less time around them, so it didn't matter anyways. But I mean, the priest at the SSPX chapel that we were going to, he was giving like 45-minute minimum sermons, minimum. And he was starting to get, as I mentioned, into like kind of like some degree of tension with some of the other parishioners there. Like there were like little, like, I don't know, like camps forming about whatever issues it was that they were debating. And I remember on like the last day of the school year or something like that, for like the last time that I was there, he was starting to be into like kind of like more open conflict with some regiments of the parishioners. And there was this sense of tension after the mass, like, during like whatever meal or whatever it was they were having at the school. And I remember at that point, I was like, I am checked out. They can do whatever little war they want about whatever it is issues they're having. I'm going outside and I'm going to go play soccer with the kids, because that's what's important here, not these people's debates about whatever problems they're having with him and vice versa. And so that was kind of like my last time there. Was the adults can haggle about whatever they're having their drama with. I'm just going to go play soccer and have fun with the younger people that I spent a lot of time around.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of saying goodbye, fading
Yeah,
away.
sort of.
Oh.
Yeah, and eventually it came up with the priest between he and I. I mean, he was, he offered a requiem mass for my father. Okay. And I'll be, I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for a lot of things from them, because I did learn a lot from them. It's just that the more that you learn, and a lot of people just stay at a certain level of reading or of learning about the faith or what have you. But the more that you take this on, and, church history and the finer points of doctrine, you start to realize, well, wait a minute, this doesn't add up what I'm getting here.
Right.
And as chaotic and, and difficult to traverse as the Roman Catholic Church itself can be sometimes, that's nothing new in history.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the center holds there, okay? The center holds there. Right. And that's what I ended up choosing. But as I was making these decisions, it felt like my soul was kind of being like ripped in half, because I was having to choose between two different things that were making a lot of claims on me, and each of them made like, a degree of sense in their own way. One of the things that happened, I think when I was still at Kent State University, I had a friend who was making an impact on me, who was a Catholic, and he and I had an interesting conversation over the phone. We would talk a lot, but I just remember one time he said to me, Kevin, God is our Father, okay? He's not a trickster. He's not a trickster. And, as far as the last 60 years of, what we think about Vatican II and the Novus Ordo Mass, et cetera, God is not here like to pull the rug out from you, okay? God loves you. God's our Father. And I just remember after that made an impact on me, and I called up the SSPX priest that I was close to, that was the head of the chapel that I was going to at the time, and I kind of like put that to him. I started putting some questions to him, and all that he really had for me in response was, like this or that about like some his interpretation of like Fatima, or like this or that, like the kinds of things that the SSPX might cite or more precisely misinterpret to bend to their narrative, okay? And it was like it got me to like kind of pull back a little bit. I was like, okay, but it wasn't really convincing. My heart was no longer with them, even if he got me to kind of like pull away for a little bit. But there came a point where I knew that I wasn't coming back anymore. He knew that I wasn't coming back. I had given him a chapter from that book that I mentioned, Econe to Rome, because I wanted to see what he'd say about it. I mean, I don't know if he ever read it or not. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but I never got any kind of a response from him about it. But there came a point just where, he said, and like we both understood, like, like I'm kind of going my own separate way now, and I'm probably not going to be back. And that was kind of the beginning of where things started to get really intense and really interesting, I feel, because what did I do? Sheesh. I taught at a Catholic college in Canada for a year, Our Lady Seat of Wisdom Academy. And that was a pretty good time. That was out in the middle of nowhere, though, I'll say. It was out in the middle of nowhere in Ontario, Canada. And it was the kind of place that had like one grocery store for the whole town. And, and that's quaint and that's neat, because you get to see everybody, getting your groceries every day.
Yeah.
And it had like one bar for the whole town. And it was nice. And, it was a great Catholic college. A little shout out to Our Lady Seat of Wisdom Academy in Canada. I taught there for a year. They offered for me to come back if I wanted to. I had some other things going that kind of brought me back to the United States, but I then gave a go at life in a Benedictine monastery. I tried out the religious life for 2 months, and it was very educational, and it was very, humbling and, very interesting, etc. But ultimately, it wasn't for me. My personality was a little bit, I need to be like out in the world, kind of just being a bit of a
pot stirrer.
Oh.
I
think you can be that in the monastery. I think you can be that in the monastery, but well, it's just that the rest of them have to live with you. But no, I just have to. I don't know. I need to be out in the world, just like exuding my personality, I suppose. And so I spent 2 months as a pre-postulant. It's like, no strings attached at all, really, aside from I signed a piece of paper saying that like I would give it an honest go for 2 months, and then I would make my decision if I want to stay further, but that was it. But it wasn't for me. And at that point I was reading some books about critical theory, which was and still is pretty much like the dominant worldview and take on the world in English studies, okay? And I was reading this stuff, and I was like, you know what? I don't agree with this stuff, but I understand what it's saying, and I bet I could go to get a PhD and go through all this and make it through. I think I could do that. And so at that point, I ended up applying to the University of Oklahoma, and I got in there, and things started to get interesting, I would say, because in terms of my studies there, I started spending a lot of time on what was called Early English Books Online. It's this database of all of these old, 16th century and earlier, just like late 15th century, but early 16th century and then 17th century, all the old pieces of writing that we still have any kind of extant copies of. You've got photocopies of all these things digitally on there that you can peruse and go through. And I was having to use a lot of that for my research. And the things that I was noticing is that Catholics and Protestants during the Reformation would argue endlessly about this, that, and everything. Okay. And those arguments go on and on and on and on, and still continue to this day. You've still got prominent Protestant apologists out there that are still arguing with their latest points that they want to make against whatever the latest points that Catholic apologists are making. And that had an impact on me that I think is going to kind of contribute to some things here. Here's the way I would put it, is the research that I was doing and the writing that I started doing became a matter of looking at certain Shakespeare plays, a handful of his plays, from the standpoint of, people had done plenty of writing already about Shakespeare's Catholic background and Shakespeare's plays in relation to things like the Eucharist, and Shakespeare's plays in relation to things like the sacrament of penance and various other religious matters. But as far as I could tell, nobody had really taken on, at least not in a comprehensive way, the way that I thought needed to be done. What, if anything, do Shakespeare's plays have to say about or resonate with when it comes to the issue of interpretive authority? And that's, huge, obviously. Okay. I mean, that's enormous. And I ended up doing a kind of a reading of a couple of his plays, starting with Twelfth Night, just from that kind of intra-Protestant conflict of whether they're going to keep episcopacy or not, to I ended up taking a look at Hamlet, and I ended up taking a look at Othello, and I ended up taking a look at one of the Romance plays, The Winter's Tale, which is a kind of a response in some ways to Othello. And I looked at it from this issue of interpretive authority. And what I came to the conclusion of is that I ultimately ended up arguing that Shakespeare in these plays sees the problem of private interpretation that was, bedeviling his time, okay, and racking Christendom to pieces, okay. He saw that as a problem that was destroying community and destroying anything approaching a unified worldview that people could, share together. And that Shakespeare is trying to answer this in his plays by rehabilitating or putting value back into the idea of trusting someone else in the world other than yourself, trusting someone else in the world when it comes to interpreting the major things in life, especially religion, and the whole drama that comes with divesting yourself of your own personal opinions and your own conclusions, and instead putting a kind of faith of sorts in another living person out there, because you already have faith in them because you have faith in Christ. Okay. He who hears you hears me,
Yeah.
and all that. So that started to inform my analysis of these plays. And it became just like this big, I was still like dealing with the problems of traditionalism. Okay. I was reading all this stuff about, of all these primary sources concerning like the conflicts with Protestantism.
Yeah.
And then there was a third layer. Okay. There's the top layer. Okay. Shakespeare dealing with Catholicism versus Protestantism in his time. But then there's the sub layer of what I was personally going through and still wrestling with traditionalism and coming to accept Vatican II and the Novus Ordo Mass. But then there's a third layer. The PhD dissertation that I wrote was really personal because beyond just the general layer of it dealing with, Catholic Protestant issues, I was still working out my split with traditionalism at the time. And, obviously there's plenty of parallels in terms of issues of intrinsic versus extrinsic authority. Again, am I going to go by my personal understanding of tradition, or am I going to learn from the living magisterium about what its own documents mean? Okay. But so there was all that as well. But I was also going through, and I still go through, something that a lot of trads experience personally, which is scrupulosity.
Oh.
Okay. And that is certainly a profound matter of, am I going to listen to myself and my own interpretation of things, or am I going to make a kind of an act of faith in the outside figure who's an authority over me? And even if I can't understand it, nonetheless take that act of, make that act of faith of sorts and try my best to live by their judgment until, my own self kind of comes to an understanding of the truth there. Am I going to work just purely on faith until then? And so I was experiencing that at the time as well. So a lot of people I hear when they write their PhD dissertations, they don't necessarily even believe what they're saying. It can be very dry stuff. It can be just something that they're doing just to get the degree and just be done with it. But for me, it was fun and dramatic and like this deeply existential vision that I was producing in the whole thing.
Wow.
Because I was living it.
Wow. I mean, and you have such a good nature about you and like this kind of optimism, in your manner and everything too. So, and there's been time that's passed since you've been through all this, but you keep making allusions, here and there to like, it was heart wrenching. It was excruciating. It was intense. Like, and that's something that, people watching this will be able to relate to from their own experiences, or maybe they're in it right now and they're just in this, like, they're just being pulled and it's like this wrenching. And it's like, in a way, I mean, that's partly your spiritual experience of what the spirit of schism works. And within your own person, it's like, it's a pulling and a dismembering. And it's like, which way are you going to go? And it's agony. So definitely, like, we don't want to downplay that because people have been through a really rough time and that from the inside, but you also know that you kept moving along, you cooperated with that process, and now there was light at the end of the tunnel, kind of thing. So
yeah, I mean, I just had to make an act of faith about things for a while in various respects. I mean, I remember one of the issues that I was trying to work through was I could not wrap my mind around the idea that Catholics could now, in some limited circumstances, in some limited situations, could pray with Protestants. I couldn't wrap my mind around that idea. And as far as I knew, and there's the key phrase, as far as I knew, that was like completely unprecedented. Okay. I mean, obviously we know that, like, we can't receive communion at a Protestant service, okay, and there's other restrictions as well, but as far as just praying with Protestants, generally speaking, okay, that's something that we're allowed to do if we're not, giving scandal or anything like that. But the thing that I was having difficulty with was like, okay, where's the church coming from with this? Is there any precedent for this? And I remember reading an article by a guy by the name of Benjamin Douglas or Ben Douglas. He had a website called like Pugio Fidei, like the dagger of faith or something. And he had this article on there in which he went into this subject and brought up some pre-Vatican II examples in which the Pope would give special permission to certain like Catholic missionaries at the time to pray with certain like groups of non-Catholics. Okay. And at that moment, I'm like, well, as far as what the Second Vatican Council has to say about this, you can have your own opinion, certainly, about whether you think it's prudent or not. But what it is lowercase o orthodox. Okay. It's in keeping with tradition. Okay. And that's the sort of thing that's just like, you just got to do a little bit more digging sometimes. And I just got tired. I got tired of, if you're a traditionalist, as far as I could tell, you had to present yourself as if you're some sort of walking, talking encyclopedia of doctrinal and disciplinary and ecclesial historical knowledge and theology, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that seems to be the assumption here. How else would these traditionalist priests presume to, be doing what they're doing here and make the claims that they make? And I just realized, I can't put up that front. That's ridiculous. There's so many people who are not traditionalists who know so much more than I do. I need to learn some things, and there's so much that I don't know. And it ultimately came down to, I need to learn from the church itself. And, it's, you've got to take yourself out of yourself, despite all the scandalous stuff in the last 60 years of what you'll find at this or that parish, despite the crisis. And there is a crisis, but it's like, how do you define the crisis? Well, we've got to define it as Catholics and within Catholic boundaries. And that includes accepting and understanding the indefectibility of the church. And once you accept and understand that, then so many of those traditionalist bypaths get closed off and are not, like up for discussion, really.
Right.
So there's just so much. There's so much. I don't know where to begin. There's just so many things I could say.
Man. I mean, it's so interesting always like talking to people about maybe their conversion to Catholicism from another faith, and it's like, well, what were the things that hung you up the most, So this is kind of like you're getting to go over some of that too, and just break it down, because it's like piece by piece you're putting it together, and and like mending these bridges, like, oh, this
Right.
allows me to get back a little closer to the church. Oh, and that one, like, it's really cool to see that. And it took time, and you were just very dedicated, and it's just proof that it can be done. And again, like this pressure, which I also felt as a traditionalist, and felt that I had to be, very educated and have all my citations to present and stuff, which
It's absurd.
It's good to know where to find things, but there's always somebody who knows more than you. And it's like, to base such assumptions that we tend to gather and hold on to as trads on the limited amount of knowledge we've happened to come into contact with, and usually from other people that like we've heard stuff from, who just happen to speak very confidently, or who have read books, and we're like, wow, we just have this impression that they have all this knowledge. So we're like, well, if I ascribe to what they say because it made sense to me, and then I quote that, but I don't really understand where it came from, or I haven't really looked at the other side. You were convincing enough to talk some other people into it maybe, but not really to hold a solid argument. And
I've read hardly any books about like Vatican II. I mean, I just got Vatican II Renewal Within Tradition. Yeah, I'm starting to read this. I'm starting to read George Weigel's book, To Sanctify the World. I've got a couple other books. I've got, things online that I've read, and I've read probably about like 3/4 or so of the documents themselves. But it's like, that's so little ultimately. That's so little. And the reason I bring it up is, are traditionalists even reading a fraction of that? For a fraction of that? Are they going to sit down and read, from cover to cover, a book defending the, yes, that's right, the last ecumenical council of the church? Okay. It's so much of this other stuff, reading encyclicals through the lens of, whatever traditionalist priest is going to give you his take on it.
Yeah.
And and all kinds of other stuff as well, without guidance from the church. Oh, well, somebody might say you can't trust the church. Well, the people that say that I know are Protestants. Okay. It comes back to the indefectibility and humility and just all kinds of things. I just don't know where to begin, but
right.
I don't know where to begin because there's so much there.
Right. Well, I mean, what you're describing is, oh shoot, I kind of lost my train. It's like making me think how they say you can't trust the church. And it's like, well, hasn't every other heretic in history said that? I mean, they're behaving the way, in point after point after point, they're behaving the way historical heretics and schismatics have behaved, not the way saints have behaved.
Yeah, and I see, you've got these people out there that want to talk plenty about, the politicking that was going on at Vatican II within the different factions and stuff like that. But John Calvin wrote a work called The Antidote to the Council of Trent, in which he gives an account. He wasn't personally there, I don't believe, but he's like giving his own kind of account via other people that he knows of, like what was happening at the Council of Trent as far as the politicking there, and how the Protestants didn't get to go there and have their say put forward enough or anything like that. And it's just like, this is the same, you're gonna always have one faction that is upset with somebody else. And there's all this stuff about, oh well, the Henry de Lubacs of the world and the von Balthasars of the world, and the other nouvelle theologians, however you pronounce it. And it doesn't matter how you pronounce it, because that's not the essence of the faith, okay? But their view of things, triumphed at the church at Vatican II. Well, what we can say is that they had some influence, and that some of their views triumphed, but whatever else, whatever Garrigou-Lagrange's problems with them were, and whatever, the other neo-Thomists, whatever their problems with the novel theologians were, whatever that was, whatever was good and true in it, God allowed to come through into the council. And you've got to accept that God's the ultimate judge and sifter of what can make it through into the next council or not, and what can't. Okay, Ronner was present at the council, but his more radical stuff did not get as much of a hearing as the Ratzingers of the world. Okay, and certainly Hans Küng didn't either. Okay, some stuff got sifted by the Holy Spirit to make it in, and some stuff didn't. And people want to take like a black and white view of like, well, either all of it shouldn't, or all of it should have. It shouldn't be like this or that. Well, at that point, you just need to back away a little bit and let the theologians handle things here, and allow them to figure things out. And you need to take a more humble position to this, because it's complicated and it's deep, and it's not as if like this figure has everything right and this figure has everything wrong.
Yeah.
It's more complicated than that. And ultimately, it's the church and its own spirit-led judgment that can sift out those things. That's how I view it, at least.
Well, when you said that, like the Holy Spirit allowed the sifting, and what was good was allowed to remain, and what was not so good didn't. And it's like it was taken care of. As soon as you said that, I felt like, because there is such a burden that we put on ourselves.
Yeah, it's nuts.
We have to figure this out. We have to be sure, and we have to do it on our own, because even the church is not a safe guide. And it's like, wrong. That's what was guaranteed to us, because Jesus knew we could not sustain that kind of a burden carried on our spiritual shoulders all through life. It would crush us. And it does so many people, and it burns them out on their faith and turns them bitter and drained. And they're like barely standing up, staggering around, carrying on whatever practices they can manage, and with all this scrupulosity and these messages telling them they're not good enough, and they've always got to be afraid and remember the crisis. And it's like, whew. And I also want to say, for anybody listening to this, if your position as a traditionalist is so rock solid and you have the true faith currently and the pure doctrine, then you have nothing to fear hearing out the other side of what you currently believe, because if that's the absolute truth, you can stand firm on that and not be shaken. You
inform your conscience.
Yes, but if you keep yourself in an echo chamber, in a bubble, you'll never know if your doctrine was pure enough and strong enough to stand the test of what else was out there. And if you are wrong, you'll never have given the truth a chance to confront you.
Yeah. And I mean, so many of the saints weren't intellectuals necessarily. They were just pious people who, simply put, trusted the church in as much as they understood what the church was teaching. Okay. And they were virtuous, sanctified persons. They didn't think that they had to become some sort of hyper intellectual. And I just find it, deeply ironic that, I mean, so many of the figures within traditionalism, kind of put themselves out there and speak of themselves amongst themselves as if they've got like the intellectual high ground here. And when you pose that against the kind of thing that you're talking about and that you've expressed here, or just anybody who wants to go out and read about this stuff and come to their own conclusions, it doesn't hold water in my eyes. It doesn't quite hold water.
That there are so many, especially as a student of history, there's so many angles to understand a situation from. Like literally, as many people as were involved in a situation, like that's how many perspectives there were, and you'll never even get to the bottom of all that. So it's like, how can you think by reading one book or talking to a few people that you're going to have a grasp on this huge historical event that was in the making for so long, that was a continuation of former historical events and councils and stuff, and then everything that came out of that you're going to just want to toss out, or even some of it, it's like, well, wait, like way above our pay grade, way over. But it's like, that should give us peace, because it's like you said, you don't have to be a genius to be a saint. You don't have to be an intellectual sifter. That wasn't our job. Like, Jesus knew we were sheep. He's like, he didn't say you have to all be in training and be your own shepherd. No, he's the shepherd.
Well, what do these people want? What do they want to do? They want to put their trust in Lefebvre, who, as John Salza has pointed out, didn't even understand that, in order for a sacrament to be sacramentally valid, okay, as far as the intention goes, the minister simply needs to intend to do what the church does, which is a very general thing. And what? Lefebvre didn't quite understand that? It's like, and this is who you're putting your trust in?
Right.
Oh,
according to his own reasoning, his own ordination would have been invalid.
What he experienced, at the time that he started to have his falling out with the Vatican, and there was, he was anybody who's read the story understands that, like, he was mistreated to some degree, in as much as there were some within the hierarchy that were kind of like shutting off certain paths of like hearings when it comes to him, and he wasn't like always getting his full due. But nonetheless, nonetheless, regardless of how he was treated at times during those times of strain, you've got to have enough perspective to then pull out and see the forest for the trees here, which is I need to react to this like a saint does, okay? And whatever a saint doesn't go and, consecrate bishops illicitly. A saint doesn't start to accuse the church with the kind of rhetoric that Lefebvre started falling into, and rejecting the church in the way that he does. Okay, I mean, you got to take a back seat and let time play out, even if things don't necessarily improve in your own lifetime. You've just got to have faith that things are going to improve in the long run, and that you don't have all the answers, and that you can't go leading this charge out of the church. I guess it was a problem of faith for him ultimately. Didn't quite have enough faith to stay in the church, unfortunately. As somebody who studies literature, I'm really passionate about the way that stories can inspire us. Okay. Like whether it be movies or books or any kind of story, like when you read something that relates or resonates with what you're going through in some kind of way, and it then inspires you to understand better your own situation or find the strength to do what's right. I know that some of you guys talk about the movie The Village in relation to traditionalism.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good one, huh?
Yeah, that's a great parallel. Oh boy, you're just sitting there watching it going, I've lived this.
Yeah. Well, why did those people in the film create that society? They were all living in an urban situation, and they experienced violence. They experienced some sort of tragedy in their life that traumatized them, that scandalized them, shall we say, but traumatized them. And it led them out of there to create like a society in reaction to that, okay, where they can get away from those problems, where they don't have to deal with those things. But of course, human nature being what it is, they do end up having to experience it. And that, it struck me, the parallels between, people who have been scandalized by, liturgical abuse or what have you, okay, and want to avoid that, and they want their kind of perfect little parishional situation, okay, but then you've got to do a lot of things to constantly keep those walls up and keep people from leaving and keep people out that they don't want in. And so those parallels struck me in that both situations are a kind of a response to trauma, whether it be urban crime or ecclesial situations.
Right.
And the thing that really got me too, though, was, of course, the main character, when she ventures out and goes over the wall, she was expecting, because she was told all that time, like there's monsters out there, and they're going, the people out there are terrible, and they're going to mistreat you, blah blah blah. And what does she encounter? She encounters a trooper out there whose character name is Kevin. And the first thing that, as he helps her, she says to him, like, this isn't what I expected. And she says, like, you're treating me with kindness. I wasn't expecting that. And that's kind of like how I felt, when I went to confession for the first time again at like a Catholic chapel. To, like, again, like I asked for the normal, just the valid words of absolution. And what did he say? That's what I give to all my penitents. And so I experienced that myself, kind of. I was expecting one thing and got another.
Oh wow, that's really a cool parallel. Wow, that's funny. Even the guy's name is Kevin. You're like, this is for me.
Yeah, and that speech that the school teacher fellow gives when he's justifying why he let Ivy, that's her character's name, isn't it? Ivy, go out to get the medicine, when he comes together with the other elders of the community, and they're questioning, why? How could you let her go? Like she's blind, and like shit. And he says she sees better than most. Okay, and he gives this speech about how she what's leading her is love. Okay, that is what the world bends to. He says the world kneels at it in awe. Traditionalists need to apply that to our own situation with the church, okay? And how much Christ loves us, and how we need to trust him, and how we need to open our hearts again to, a a church that, because it's partly human, it has its human aspect, so it's imperfect on a human level, but is perfect on a supernatural level. Need to open our hearts back up and, let that church bring us back in. We need to be drawn by love, because that's what's waiting for us outside of the kind of restricted and, I don't know, cultish and whatever else, people want to say about it, kind of confines of traditionalism, where it's bitterness and a coldness and a lack of trust and a cynicism.
Yeah, definitely fear-based and very confining and life-sucking. We don't thrive in an environment like that. And it's really a dead end. I mean, it's just like the village. It was so insulated. It couldn't really grow that
Nope.
much. No, it was not going to be sustainable unless outsiders came in. But then you're opening yourself up to hurt. It's like,
Yeah, I guess the big question at the end of the movie is whether Ivy and I forget what the guy's name is, the one that's played by Joaquin Phoenix, that she's come back to help, whether she particularly is going to tell people about what she's learned about the outside world. And I think the general sense of Ivy's character is that she's not going to necessarily be able to keep quiet about that.
how could you?
Yeah, but
It's like the Matrix. Which pill are you going to take? Do you want
yeah.
to deal with the reality no matter how difficult it may be? Or do you just want to live in denial and an illusion because you've judged that that is better and safer? And you better have a lot of confidence in your own judgment. I don't trust my own judgment that much. I trust the church's judgment more.
Well, that's the thing about scrupulosity, and that's the thing about private judgment, and that's the thing about traditionalism, is it seems like it's the safe path. Why? Because whether you realize it or not, it's your own judgment, and who doesn't want to go with their own judgment naturally? Who feels frightened, especially when the rubber hits the road and what you think about something is at odds with and doesn't make sense in relation to something else coming from an external authority that you're called upon to trust? Naturally, you're going to feel safer going with your own judgment, but it's not in the long run. It's not putting faith in the other, okay, that ultimately leads to God. And what do you know? What do you know?
Yeah. Well, in a way, it's abdicating your own responsibility to know what you ought to know. And it's sort of directing you to learn all these things you don't really need to know to be a faithful, holy Catholic. It's like, but people are driven to that sometimes because of the experiences they've had. Like your mom was disturbed by liturgical experiences she should never have been subjected to. That was not right. And people were
Sure.
scandalized. And that's something we, definitely need to address because there's people that many people out there who are in these movements, not because they believe in the movement per se, but they just wanted a haven. They didn't want to be distracted and disrupted and have to suffer feeling violated at mass when they just wanted to go and pray. And that's 100% legitimate. They also need to know that while they've been gone, things have gotten a lot better in the church. And even
Yeah.
if they weren't, why is it better to jump out of the boat and be floundering around the ocean by yourself? Because that's what you have nobody out there. every individual is on their own, every man for himself in traditionalism. You will never find another soul that you can be 100% in communion with and aligned on all points of doctrine, because it's impossible.
On principle.
Yes. Yeah. No way. It's impossible. Yes. So you are choosing to be completely alone and maybe even cut off from God, even though you're making this move because you wanted to be with him. And it's like, see how the devil gets people? It's so insidious.
Well, I don't think they take much comprehension to the idea that you can go too far to the right as much as you can, like, make the mistake of going too far to the left. There isn't always a too far to the right as part of the mentality there. And I mean, on another note, like, some people want to claim that, well, without Lefebvre doing what he did, then, one wouldn't still have the traditional Latin Mass, in as much as we still do have it after Traditionis Custodes. My response to that is twofold, in as much as, A, the faith does not rise or fall on the existence of the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Latin Mass. As many saints as have been nourished by it as there have been, granted. And one of the ways that we know that, among all kinds of ways, is there's plenty of people, like on the other side of the world, that are, that are celebrating and being nourished by the Novus Ordo Mass, and are like living as martyrs. Okay. And, they don't know the Latin Mass out there. They know whatever form of the Novus Ordo Mass they've been given, or, what a concept, some other rite within the Roman Catholic Church, okay, whether it be like the Byzantine or, what have you, okay. But then also, just on top of that, if you want to claim that, well, one wouldn't have the Latin Mass without Lefebvre doing what he did, well, could not. Do you want to then argue that we wouldn't have had the Council of Trent had Luther not done what he did? I mean, we still needed reforms, but we didn't need somebody, running out of the church over the matter. Okay. Would the church have decided or felt the urgency, even after it took a long time, to finally have the reforms that it did after the Protestant Reformation became what it did? Well, that doesn't justify the Reformation, does it? I mean,
right. Well, the ends don't justify the means, but for traditionalists, they often do. So it's like, I mean, it's such a departure from essential moral theology, but it's like, but it escapes them yet. And there you go. It's like, you can't say that if God willed for the TLM, as it were, to continue, he would have made it continue without Lefebvre, because that's also saying that like discussion within the church and respectful requests for things would totally not have been heard. That is so unjust to the church to say that. And look at the trend that the church has taken with this whole synodality thing, which actually isn't unprecedented in Catholic history. But anyway, it's like that idea of listening and like the family gathering of like, let everyone be heard. There's still a father who will make the ultimate decision in everyone's best interest, but he wants to hear everyone out. And that's, they would all have been heard. It would have been taken care of, and it would have been peacefully done without causing a break in the body and all this melee. And so, but you're saying that like a sin had to happen, that a good thing. I was like, no, God brings good out of sin, because he's great. He's greater than our sin, but that doesn't make it okay. And holy cow, it's such a dim view of God's generosity and provision. It's like, why do you think you have to steal to be fed?
I see. Have you ever heard of a guy by the name of Brian Sudlow?
No.
So he's the guy who translated Lefebvre, a biography on Lefebvre, a very famous biography on Lefebvre. He translated, I think, like, I don't know, maybe like French into English or something like that. And so he was a friend of the SSPX for some time, and he actually spent some time in their seminaries. Okay, he was going to go into their clergy. Ultimately, he didn't, and he backed away from the SSPX. But I came across his blog a long time ago. You can still find it on the Wayback Machine, if you know of that thing. And it was called The Sensible Bond. And he had a lot of like very sharp, interesting, kind of like, from the inside, formerly of the inside, as somebody who was in their seminaries, now on the outside in a normal diocesan situation. He had a lot of, like very sensible things to say about their whole situation, the kind of the conundrum that they've gotten in terms of their ecclesiology and everything else surrounding them. He was another influence on me. The very man who translated the foremost Lefebvre biography from French into English, I think it was. He left traditionalism and had a big influence on me as well.
Wow.
It's those ex-traditionalists that are really sharp, that include people like John Salza, I think, that it just seems like they don't want to deal with.
Yeah. Right. No, they don't. And so yeah, that's why I tell people who contact me, sometimes they're distressed, their daughter's gone into a sedevacantist convent, or their son has gone SSPX or something, or they're just like, why did this have to happen? I'm like, God is allowing these things to happen for so many reasons, but also most of these people he brings back at some point, and they have now learned from the other side what to say to other people to save them from the same trap. It's like, or also to help facilitate healing for other people who have been hurt and don't know where to start reintegrating into the church and sorting all this out. There are some people whose voices can rise to clear all that confusion and to lead people back. And so that's partly why he's allowing it. So I mean, it's like, don't give up, because it's a process. And even don't beat yourself if you realize you spent, decades in some weird schismatic cult and you're like, why did I do that? I meant to do good. And look what I screwed up my family. And it's like, God's not finished with this story yet. There's so much
Mm.
going to come out of this. So don't shortchange him, because he's got a
And
whole big plan.
and start by reading the documents. Start by reading the documents. You'll be surprised how unambiguous they are and how enriching they are, and for like points that are more like difficult to understand, there's plenty that's out there that's been written and is still being written about dignitates humanae or this or that, which you just need to be like, this is bigger than me, what they're talking about here, and I've got a lot to learn, and people are still learning, and whatever the answer is, it's not a group that is sure of themselves about like this particular point or that point, that the church is wrong and it needs to double back on whatever it's done here, and that there's a flat contradiction here. Like, you don't necessarily understand the encyclicals from the past. You don't necessarily understand how the church understood those at the time and is like further commenting on and developing its understanding now. You don't know the levels of authority. Like I just feel like I know so little and have so much to learn here. And I mean, once some of the basic things, you start to see some of the basic things, then you're willing to make allowances for and go on a limb more and make more of an act of faith for the things that might be more complicated. So, I mean, I remember like when I was first starting to read the Second Vatican Council documents, I remember hearing from some traditionalists about how the documents, I think it was one of the early documents, obscures the distinction between the sacramental priesthood of the clergy and the priesthood that the laity enjoy to some degree. And for one thing, they might have been calling into question the latter in the first place when, well, wait a minute, like, we do act, us laity, as priests in as much as we offer up our daily sacrifices and our offerings and everything about us to God. Okay, we are acting as a kind of priest there. And especially at the Mass, we're not just watching, we're offering up our lives and our sufferings, et cetera, on the altar. We're doing that. So there's that. But then, like, I read the document, okay, and I'm like, I don't see any lack of distinction here. It's perfectly clear to me that here they're talking about the clergy, here they're talking about the laity. The only possible problems that somebody could have with what's going on here is they didn't understand it in the first place, or they have talked themselves into there being a discrepancy here where there isn't one. And like, it was just starting with things like that, like easy stuff. Like, wait a minute, they don't understand this point here when it seems so obvious to me. Oh, there's a traditionalist speaker here. I'll give you an example. There's a traditionalist speaker here who objected to the church being said to be like a pilgrim church. Okay. Or the idea that the church is going on some kind of a pilgrimage. And this traditional speaker objected to that and made it out to be like that the church knows who it is and it knows where it is, and it's, it has the truth, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't need to go on like a pilgrimage to find it, has the truth, blah, blah, blah. And he was basing all this just like on just the bare language of like pilgrim church, or the idea of the church going on a pilgrimage. And eventually, like, I came across St. Augustine's City of God, in which at least once in there, I remember him referring to something about like pilgrim church or church going on a pilgrimage. And it's like, well, wait a minute. That's an easy one, isn't it? Now, like, we need to understand this correctly, sure, but don't go telling me that the phrase like pilgrim church is some modernist innovation. If you can find it, I bet if you find it in St. Augustine, then you can start to find it in other places too. They don't know the tradition. And that's not to say that they have to and that they should. Again, this is so like we're supposed to be learning here, but then don't go and turn it against the church if you don't know the tradition.
Right. No, and I found just with the little bit of digging I've done on various issues, it's like almost immediately there's an aha moment. You're like, oh, wow, now I understand so much more. It's like your horizons just expand, and then you're like, this is really exciting. And it's often really beautiful, like very edifying, especially when you go to the document sources themselves and read them. It's like, I'm so glad I did that. I wonder what else there is that I haven't found yet. And it's like, it just goes on and on. It's like the church has all the answers. You just have to look for them. And sometimes you don't realize how little you have looked.
Yes. Yeah. And it can take a lifetime to learn even, so much about these things. There was another example that just came to mind a moment ago. What was it? In the Novus Ordo Mass, what is it? After the Our Father, we say something like, and what's the phrase?
For the kingdom, the power, and the glory.
Yes. And that's like a big problem for some people, apparently. Now, what's the issue here? The issue is that apparently in like Protestant liturgies, Protestants use that phrasing. So the thinking is that, well, we got that from the Protestants or something. Now, my first issue is, well, wait a minute. Does God have the, what is it again? What's the phrase?
The power and the glory.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, like, yes, he does. He does have the kingdom and the power and the glory. Okay. So it checks out in terms of lower orthodoxy. But then further than that, I did like a little bit of investigation. Well, where did the Protestants get it? I forgot which one exactly. They got it from the church fathers. They got it from one of the church fathers. Okay. So
it's
I don't care, if it comes from the Catholic tradition and the Protestants picked it up at one point, well, they use the Trinity too, unless they're anti-Trinitarians. They use all kinds of other things that are still Catholic elements. Okay. do we really want to raise like a huge problem about this?
Oh yeah,
Okay,
I mean, it's giving
it's
them
just
credit for the origins of things that they did not invent, that they borrowed from us. It's like
yes.
they wouldn't even be there if it wasn't for the Catholic Church. So I don't think, yeah, we don't need to take issue with it unless it's a total innovation on their part, but it isn't. And that phrase is from scripture, and it's like it's not. I mean, I think at one point, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody in the comments probably will, but I thought that phrase was in an earlier form of the liturgy and was removed at some point and was actually restored after Vatican II.
Now, there's people who count up the number of certain types of prayers and references in the Tridentine Latin Mass and then compare it with how many references or how many genuflections or how many this or how many that are in, like the in the Novus Ordo Mass, okay, and vice versa, they'll compare, and they'll find the Novus Ordo Mass like wanting, and in that regard, and say like, well, why do we have this many fewer prayers of this kind, or this many fewer references, or this or that, and that's simply a matter of math, okay? Like, comparison. But then it's about what do you make of it? What do you make of it?
Yeah, my father only told me he loved me once a day, but my friend's father tells him twice a day that he loves him. That means my friend's father loves him more than my father loves me.
So at that point, if somebody wants to take a stand and say, well, because the Novus Ordo Mass includes this fewer amount of prayers about this particular thing or this fewer references, and therefore it's like inferior, or it's not Catholic, or it's or like it shouldn't be attended. My question is, who gets to decide this highly supernatural, metaphysical matter of how much is too much or how much is too little? Because you can always do more. You can always do more, okay? And we can always be doing more. We can be crawling up to the communion rail, okay? And in order to receive communion, but the church doesn't require that of us, okay? So who's to make the grand judgment of knowing God's mind of what are the, shall we say, like the minimal requirements or the normative requirements, whatever you want to say, for our time period about what is acceptable for the liturgy? Again, if not the church, then who? Okay. Otherwise, again, it's private judgment of like, well, I think that it should have this many references and not just this many. Well, who are you? Okay. And you're not the one accepting the worship. God is. Okay. Yeah. Let the church decide. And if it's one way in one period of the church's history and something else in another period and something else in another, I'm just a layman. I just trying to, I'm not privy to the movements of divine providence as far as where it wants the liturgy to, do this or do that at a certain, abuses aside, of course, abuses aside.
Yeah.
One really has to go above one's pay grade in order to start to form opinions about these things to the point of taking a stand against the church itself. It's just mind-boggling.
Right. Well, and I was curious. I was just going to ask you, Kevin. I mean, you've transitioned away from this. You've done a lot of processing over the years. What kind of spiritual place are you in now compared to when you were locked in traditionalism?
I definitely still struggle with scrupulosity. That's just, I don't know if that came from traditionalism or other places, because I think there's a number of factors involved, but that's something I wrestle with. And so that kind of goes, there's people who have difficulties with, you'll find people who would be like, I struggle with believing in the resurrection, or the Christ resurrection, or this or that big thing. And I would always kind of look at them and be like, well, thank God I don't have to deal with that kind of like struggle of faith, like, the resurrection of Christ from the dead. Oh, that's easy. You know what I mean? Yeah. But then I think to myself, well, okay, well, people are going to have a struggle of faith of some kind or another. And so it comes out in this other stuff for me, okay? Like trying to understand and accept what the church has to say about, you know, like me as an individual and my conscience, okay? And understanding that. So I think that that's something I wrestle with. But as far as like what I do nowadays and where my spiritual life is at, I'm trying to focus more on the virtues, okay, and actually grow in holiness, because I've got a long way to go, okay, before I get to that paradise, okay, and I'm I guess what I'm finding is if I'm going to have any hope of making even the smallest amount of progress, you've got to come up with a plan. You've got to come up with something practical. And what I've found seems like it's going to be useful is, I don't know what book I got this out of, because I read a couple books on this kind of stuff last year. And I went back to try and find, I can't find anywhere. I found it in some book, but it was all like, okay, just focus on one fault or one vice of yours at a time. And for the different days of the week, draw like a horizontal line, you know, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, one line for each day. And then, at the end of the day, put a couple dots in for as many times that you felt that you fell into that problem, and just do that over the course of the week. And even just doing that, keeping track of it, it helps you to become more mindful. So I don't know. I'm just trying to focus now on the virtue aspect of this stuff. I'm trying to read more about some of the like more controversial things in Vatican II. Again, like Dignitatis Humanae, seems to be the one that so much ink has been spilt. Okay. And I don't know. I love reading Ratzinger. I'm reading, I don't know, all kinds of other books. I've got this one going, Cultivating Virtue. It's supposed to be, like there's a page every day, for every day of the year. I've already gotten off of that, and now it's just more of like I'll just read the next page for the next day, because I fall out of it. I don't keep consistent. I'm just trying to find some amount of consistency in my life, and that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, no, that's really good. It's very positive view, and that you are educating yourself on points that you've had questions about or have heard other people have questions about. Now you're really a great resource. You've read so many things. I mean, I'm sure even if viewers have questions and they want to direct them to you, I might be able to
Sure.
you guys, just for resources and experience and stuff, because you've got a lot to draw on. And now it's like you're trying predominantly to focus on growing yourself, and that's okay. Like that's an okay focus. And being eaten up with issues and controversy, it's like it'll always be there, but you're not going to let it take your joy, consume your focus. You are directing it more straight towards God, and that sounds really healthy.
Yeah, and I mean, I've had some other friends who came out of traditionalism too for a normal diocesan situation, and as they were coming out of it, they were coming forth with like traditionalist kind of controversy type books and stuff like that. And sometimes when they would come forth with it, like and try to get me to read it or try to get me to like give some sort of opinion about it, I just started really taking this mindset, this tack of like, I am done with that stuff. Okay, none of that is getting me any closer to heaven. None of that is making me more Christ-like, and it's all just going down rabbit holes, which I don't know, like 100 years ago, before we had the internet and televisions and TVs, Catholics really, your laity would not even be aware of or reading about or worrying about. Okay. And that's kind of where I'm at. I'm just like so done with it all because of the very, just the very practical reason that I've just got this realization that I'm 40. I'm at that point in my life where I can't even remember how old I am exactly off the top of my head. I'm 44 years old, and as far as I'm concerned, my life's about half up at this point, and I've got a long way to go with about half of my life left, hopefully. I don't know what'll happen tomorrow, but there's just so much that needs to be done, and I can't waste it on the objections of a group of clerics that are obsessed with French politicking of the 19th century. Okay, because that's what it breaks down to ultimately. There's just too much out there. I've got half my life to live still, and I've got so much work to be done that it's got to be Jesus transforming me now. And guess what? The baseline foundation for that has to be trust in the church, and I'll go from there. I'm done with this stuff. I'm reading about it. I'll read it, but I'm done. It was the center of one's spiritual life ultimately, whether one realized it or not, because it had to be, because of the nature of the position that one was taking as a traditionalist.
Right.
If you're putting yourself at odds with the church like that, how aren't you going to be constantly defending yourself?
Right. No, and as a friend of mine who left the SSPX and then set up a Vacantism later said, she's like, they keep the crisis fresh all the time in their sermons and conversations and stuff, because without that focus keeping you on that, there's no reason for you to stay. So they have to always kind of inflate it and remind you, and it's exhausting. And you're just like, oh yeah, the crisis. And it's like, there's way more to being Catholic than just hanging on in the crisis. And you actually lose most of the good of being in the church. And sometimes you end up leaving the church over it. And because you were focusing so much on that, it's like, that's not really what we're asked to do. And, to be Catholic is to be in crisis. There's always been crazy stuff. Just pick up some history books, read about the church. You'll understand that things have been way worse before now, and that this is already improving a lot. It's like, this is the historical character of cycles. But who will tell you that until you take your head out of the bubble and you take in air somewhere else? It's like, there's better and more things out there. And I just want to encourage people. There's so much, and God he does not want you to be missing out. He's not trying to strip you, deprive you. On the contrary, there's even more richness, but you haven't been told where to look for it. You've been told to look away from it, actually.
Right. Yeah. But I'll try to float resources to people as best I can. And I've only got so many answers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can also direct people to, I always put my email in the description of the video, lauravandervoss@outlook.com. So just look down there and you can always email through me. And I
plus connect. Your guys' trad recovery website has the resources on there. And I don't know, when I first came across you guys, I did not have, I didn't know to the extent that I understand now that there's like people that have been like traumatized, okay, and have all kinds of like bad situations. I never was within traditionalism to that extent to have anything like, truly negative happen to me. But when I first came across you guys, I was like, what is this? Like, oh my gosh. Like, so they were part of like a group that, was saying the Latin Mass illicitly. And, granted, they walked away from it. Okay. But like, did it really like screw up their lives all that much? Was it really that bad? Okay. Like, what are they doing now? But then I saw, like, as I read more and more of what's on your guys' website, that, that people are quite serious there, and people have been through all kinds of things. And you guys are pretty, intellectually hardcore on there. Andrew Meone's book, for example. I mean, I read that recently. It's like, yeah, somebody take this on. I'd like to see this, okay? Because this is pretty rigorous here. And so, yeah, I started taking you guys more seriously. I'm sorry if I didn't at first. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with at first.
Oh, you're good. No.
For anything that I encounter in the church nowadays that's like official teaching, whether it be Dignitatis Humanae or whatever, if it's something that like I don't understand yet, or I'm still working on like trying to understand, then yeah, I give the benefit of the doubt to the church because I may not understand everything during my lifetime, and I don't have to. That's that's why there is such a thing as what is it? The difference between material heresy and formal heresy. Plenty of people are probably material heretics in as much as they think that the church teaches X and actually teaches Y, but they've got goodwill. They want to learn, they want to conform to what the church teaches, okay? And when that's the internal disposition, as it's going to be with imperfect human beings, then there's no problem because you still have communion, you still have love, you still have trust, you still have faith. And it's simply then a matter of learning. And you've got an attitude of, I'm not the be all end all here. There's something that I must be missing and it's what the church says is true, whether or not I understand it or not. Okay, because again, it doesn't come back to me ultimately. To use a Switchfoot song of a the Switchfoot band. I don't go in for Christian rock, but I find some of their songs inspiring a little bit. They've got a song called You, and the key part of the song that keeps getting repeated is it it's not in me, it's you, it's in you, the answer is in you, and ultimately it's about God. It's not about me, it's about God.
That's that's a great thought, and even a good point that you make, Kevin. For the sake of the scrupulous, because we don't want to put people in more fear than they already are. Like, oh my gosh, I could be a material heretic in so many ways, and it's like, yeah, but like it's not make or break because your intention is what God looks at. He
Yeah,
looks at your
there's
heart.
no culpability.
Right? Yeah, so that's very consoling, and it's just like it doesn't keep you from heaven because if at some point you encountered that you were wrong on a point, if you had a malleable spirit, to be docile to the Holy Spirit, you would change that opinion, and God knows what you would do. So He takes it as if you did, and that's yeah.
Sure.
There's so much mercy. It's a bottomless well of mercy, but if we refuse it, they won't help us. But it's open if you are willing to accept it. So yeah, there's just so much good stuff, Kevin. We could talk all night.
Yes, we could.